I checked my watch one more time before spotting James walking toward the fence line. He had that familiar grin on his face, the one he always wore when we were about to do something we probably shouldn't. 2 years of exploring together had taught me to recognize that look. "Ready for some nostalgia?" James called out as he approached the gap in the chain-link fence surrounding Riverside General Hospital. The building rose up in front of us, 4 stories of abandoned medical history that had become my second home over the past 2 years. Most people saw decay when they looked at places like this. I saw stories. Every broken window, every piece of graffiti on the lower walls, every scattered piece of equipment told me something about what this place used to be and who had been here since it closed. James ducked through the fence opening first, his camera bag slung across his shoulder. I followed, my own gear feeling comfortable and familiar against my back. The main lobby entrance stood slightly ajar, the way it always did. Someone had kicked in the door months ago, and the building's security had given up trying to keep people out. We stepped inside, and I immediately felt that sense of coming home that abandoned buildings always gave me. The lobby stretched out before us, broken ceiling tiles scattered across the floor like oversized confetti. Old medical equipment sat in corners where scavengers had left it, either too damaged to steal or too heavy to carry. A rusty wheelchair sat near what used to be the reception desk, its vinyl seat cracked and peeling. "Man, this place still gives me chills," James said, pulling out his camera to take a few shots of the lobby. Good chills, though. I led him down the main hallway, our flashlights cutting through the darkness that had settled into the building. The electrical system had been stripped out years ago, along with most of the copper piping and anything else worth selling. That left us with just our lights and whatever natural illumination filtered through the broken windows. "Remember that room where they kept the gynecological equipment?" I asked, turning left down a corridor I could navigate blindfolded. "The stirrups are still there." James laughed and followed me deeper into the building. We passed room after room, most with their doors standing open, or missing entirely. Patient rooms that once housed people recovering from surgeries or dealing with psychiatric care now stood empty except for the occasional piece of furniture too heavy to move. Hospital beds with their mattresses long since removed. Broken medical cabinets with their glass doors shattered. I stopped at one particular room and aimed my flashlight inside. This was the psychiatric wing. You can tell by the reinforced windows and the way the door frames are built. James stepped up beside me and took several photos, the flash illuminating the small space in brief, stark detail. The walls still had that institutional beige paint, though it was peeling and stained now. Someone had spray-painted a message on one wall that I couldn't quite make out in the flashlight beam. We moved methodically through the first floor, checking rooms we'd both seen before, but that James wanted to photograph again. He was always better at documenting our explorations than I was. I preferred to just experience the places, to feel their history and imagine what they'd been like when they were alive with activity. "You know what I love about coming back here?" James said as we walked down another hallway. "It's like visiting an old friend. The building changes a little each time, but the bones stay the same." He was right. Each visit revealed new damage, new graffiti, new signs that other people had been here. But the essential character of the place remained constant. The long hallways with their cracked linoleum floors, the nurses' stations with their built-in desks and communication systems, the patient rooms with their small windows and institutional fixtures. We spent almost an hour moving through the first floor, James taking photos while I shared stories from previous explorations. I told him about the time I'd found a medical chart that had somehow been missed when they cleared out the building, about the urban explorer from Chicago who'd gotten lost in here for 3 hours because he'd ignored my warnings about the layout, about the homeless guy who'd been squatting in one of the rooms until security finally chased him out. The building felt different at night than it did during the day. Not scarier exactly, but more intimate. Our flashlights created pools of visibility in an ocean of darkness, making each room feel isolated and separate. The silence was more complete too, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional sound of something settling deeper in the building. "You want to see something that always gets a reaction out of newcomers?" I asked James as we finished checking the last room on the first floor. "Sure. What have you got?" I aimed my flashlight toward the stairwell at the end of the hallway. "The morgue. It's down in the basement level. Most people think they're ready for it, but there's something about being underground in a place like this that hits different." James shouldered his camera bag and followed me toward the stairs. "Lead the way. I trust your judgment on these things." The stairwell door stood partially open, revealing concrete steps that disappeared down into darkness below. I pulled the door wider and stepped onto the first step, testing it with my weight before committing fully. The stairs were solid, built to last in a way that most of the building's other fixtures weren't. "Stay close," I said, starting our descent into the lower level. The basement's a whole different world down here. The concrete stairs ended at a heavy metal door that opened with a creak I'd heard dozens of times before. But stepping into the basement always felt like entering a different building entirely. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees down here, and the air carried that distinctive smell of old concrete and accumulated dampness that never quite left underground spaces. My flashlight beam swept across the main corridor, revealing the familiar layout I'd memorized from previous visits. The basement level stretched out in both directions, with doorways leading to what had once been storage areas, mechanical rooms, and administrative spaces. Most of the rooms were empty now, cleared out when the hospital closed or picked clean by scavengers over the years. "This way," I said, leading James to the left toward the morgue area. "The medical record storage is down this hall first." We walked past a series of doors, most standing open to reveal empty rooms with concrete floors and metal shelving units. James stopped at one doorway and aimed his camera inside, the flash illuminating rows of empty filing cabinets pushed against the walls. "They really cleaned this place out," he said, checking the photo on his camera's display screen. "The records got moved when they closed. Everything else just got abandoned or stolen over time." I kept walking, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The basement corridors were narrower than the ones upstairs, built for function rather than patient comfort. Overhead, exposed pipes and electrical conduits ran along the ceiling, most of them stripped of their copper wiring years ago. The morgue occupied a corner section of the basement, accessible through double doors that had lost their window glass. I pushed through first, my flashlight revealing the space I'd shown to probably a dozen other urban explorers over the past 2 years. The room was larger than most people expected, maybe 20 feet by 15 feet, with concrete walls painted in that institutional white that had yellowed with age. 3 metal examination tables sat bolted to the floor in a row, their surfaces stained and scratched but still intact. They were too heavy and too permanently attached for anyone to steal, which left them as the room's primary remaining feature. Along one wall, old drainage systems and plumbing fixtures showed where equipment had once been connected. James walked around the tables, taking photos from different angles. The flash created stark shadows on the walls, giving the room a dramatic appearance that never quite matched what I saw with just the flashlight beam. "These tables are the real deal," he said, running his hand along the edge of one. "Stainless steel, probably built to last forever. Everything else got stripped out years ago, refrigeration units, scales, all the actual equipment. But these things weren't going anywhere." I walked to the far end of the room where cabinets had once housed medical supplies and tools. Most of the cabinet doors hung open or had been removed entirely, revealing empty shelves and the occasional piece of forgotten equipment. A few surgical instruments had been left behind, too corroded or damaged to be worth taking. James moved methodically around the room, documenting the space from every angle he could think of. I'd watched him work in dozens of locations, and he always took the same careful approach. Wide shots to capture the overall space, detail shots of interesting features, and close-ups of anything that told a story about the building's history. "You know what's weird?" he said, lowering his camera for a moment. "This room doesn't feel as creepy as I expected. I mean, it's obviously a morgue, but it just feels empty now. That's because it's been empty for so long. The building has its own personality, but death doesn't stick around in places like this. Just the architecture remains. We spent another 10 minutes in the morgue while James finished his photography session. I used the time to check areas I hadn't examined closely in previous visits, looking for details that might have changed or things I'd missed before. The room never revealed anything new, but I'd learned that abandoned buildings could surprise you if you paid attention. James was packing his camera gear when we both heard it. A scraping sound, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. We both stopped moving and listened. The sound came again after a few seconds, something being dragged across concrete, or maybe metal scraping against stone. It lasted only a moment before fading into the building's usual silence. "Other explorers?" James asked, keeping his voice low. "Probably. This place gets a lot of visitors, especially on weekends." But something about the sound bothered me. It wasn't the kind of noise I associated with urban explorers moving through the building. Too deliberate, too focused. Most people exploring abandoned places made a lot more noise than that, especially when they thought they were alone. "Should we check it out?" James asked. I considered the question while listening for any additional sounds. The basement had several corridors I'd never fully explored, mainly because they led to mechanical areas that didn't hold much interest. But if someone else was down here, they might be accessing parts of the building I'd missed. "Yeah, let's take a look. Might be someone who knows areas we haven't seen." We left the morgue and headed back toward the main corridor. The sound had come from the right, down a hallway that led toward what I assumed were mechanical rooms and additional storage areas. I'd walked past the entrance many times, but had never bothered investigating because the corridor appeared to dead end after about 50 feet. My flashlight beam led the way as we turned down the hallway. The walls were the same concrete construction as the rest of the basement, but this area felt more isolated from the main hospital structure. Fewer doorways, more solid walls, like it had been built for specific utility purposes rather than general hospital functions. We passed 2 small rooms that contained old mechanical equipment, boiler connections, electrical panels that had been stripped of anything valuable, pipe connections that no longer led anywhere. The kind of infrastructure spaces that kept the hospital running when it was operational. The hallway continued further than I'd realized. What had looked like a dead end from the main corridor actually curved to the right, extending the basement layout beyond what I'd mapped in my head during previous visits. The scraping sound came again, clearer now and definitely ahead of us. James moved closer behind me, and I could hear his breathing change slightly. Not fear exactly, but increased alertness. The corridor ended at a heavy door marked "Storage" in faded black letters. The door stood slightly ajar, maybe 6 inches open, revealing darkness beyond. I'd never noticed this door before, which surprised me given how many times I'd been in the basement. I approached the door carefully and pushed it open wider. My flashlight beam swept across a small room with concrete walls on all sides. The space was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, smaller than most of the other basement rooms. Old hospital equipment sat scattered around the floor, but not the kind of valuable items that would have been removed during the building's closure. James stepped up beside me, and his flashlight joined mine in illuminating the room. Broken wheelchairs, damaged monitoring equipment, a few cardboard boxes that had disintegrated with moisture over the years. The kind of medical debris that had been too worthless or too damaged to bother moving. I was about to suggest we head back when my flashlight beam caught something in the far corner. Partially hidden under a pile of old hospital gowns and what looked like torn privacy curtains, a section of the floor appeared different from the rest. I walked across the room and pulled away the fabric, revealing a wooden surface in the concrete floor. It was a trap door, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, with metal hinges along one edge and a recessed handle on the opposite side. "David," James said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "What is that?" I knelt down next to the trap door and brushed away more debris. The wood was old but solid, and the hinges showed signs of recent use. No rust, no corrosion, like someone had been maintaining them. "I have no idea," I said, running my hand along the edge where the door met the concrete floor. "I've been in this building dozens of times, and I've never seen this before." The trapdoor fit perfectly into the concrete, professionally installed rather than cut in later. This wasn't some makeshift addition by urban explorers or homeless people. It was part of the original building construction, hidden under years of accumulated debris until someone had recently cleared it off. James crouched down beside me, his flashlight beam focused on the metal hinges. "Should we open it?" I stared at the handle, feeling that familiar mixture of curiosity and caution that came with discovering something new in a familiar place. In 2 years of exploring Riverside General, I thought I'd seen everything the building had to offer. Finding this door felt like discovering a room I'd somehow missed in my own house. I gripped the recessed handle and pulled upward. The trap door lifted smoothly on its hinges, revealing a dark opening that dropped down into what looked like a tunnel entrance. My flashlight beam penetrated maybe 6 feet before the passage curved away into complete darkness. The opening was just wide enough for a person to fit through, maybe 3 feet across. Concrete walls extended into the tunnel, and I could see that someone had built this with serious intention. The construction looked professional, not like the makeshift passages I'd seen in other abandoned buildings where homeless people or vandals had broken through walls. "This is definitely not standard hospital architecture," I said, leaning further over the opening to get a better look. James crouched beside me and aimed his flashlight down into the tunnel alongside mine. "Where do you think it goes?" "No idea. Could connect to the old steam tunnels, or maybe it's some kind of maintenance access that got forgotten over the years." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. The construction was too deliberate, too clean. Steam tunnels would have pipes running through them, and maintenance passages would have utility connections. This tunnel looked like it had been built for people to move through, nothing else. I swung my legs over the edge and dropped down into the opening. The tunnel was taller than it had looked from above, maybe 4 feet high, which meant I'd have to crawl but wouldn't be completely cramped. The floor was smooth concrete, and the walls showed the same professional construction as the trapdoor frame. "David," James said from above, "maybe we should think about this." "It's fine, I just want to see where it goes. We'll stay close to the entrance." That wasn't entirely true. I wanted to know where this tunnel led, how far it extended, what it connected to. Finding something this substantial and unknown in a building I'd explored dozens of times felt like discovering a secret room in my childhood house. James dropped down behind me with considerably less enthusiasm. His camera bag scraped against the tunnel walls as he tried to position himself. "This is definitely not built for comfort," he muttered. I started crawling forward, my flashlight beam leading the way. The tunnel extended straight ahead for about 10 feet before curving to the right. The walls maintained their smooth concrete finish, and the ceiling showed the same level of professional construction. Someone had spent real money and effort building this passage. James followed behind me, his breathing slightly labored from the awkward position and the weight of his camera equipment. The tunnel forced us to move single file, and the sound of our movements created a strange echo that seemed to stretch much further ahead than our lights could reach. After crawling for what felt like several minutes, my knees starting to ache against the concrete floor, the tunnel began to change. The floor angled upward slightly, creating a gradual incline that made the crawling more difficult but suggested we were heading toward another level or building. "How far do you want to keep going?" James asked, his voice carrying a note of strain. "Just a little further. I think we're heading up toward ground level." The incline continued for another 50 feet or so before the tunnel opened into a larger space. I could feel the change before I could see it, the way the air moved differently and our sounds no longer echoed off close walls. My flashlight beam revealed a small chamber, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, with wooden walls instead of concrete. Directly above us, a ladder made of wooden rungs extended upward to what looked like another trap door. The construction was different here, more like shed or barn building than the professional concrete work of the tunnel itself. I climbed the ladder first, testing each rung carefully before putting my full weight on it. The wood felt solid, well maintained rather than rotted or neglected. At the top, I pressed my hands against the trap door above and pushed gently upward. The door lifted easily, revealing a rectangle of lesser darkness above. I pushed it open wider and hauled myself up through the opening, emerging inside what was clearly a small wooden building. My flashlight revealed walls made of rough planks, a slanted roof overhead, and a dirt floor covered with various equipment and supplies. James climbed up behind me, and we both stood up for the first time since entering the tunnel. The relief of being able to straighten my back was immediate, though the shed's low ceiling meant I still had to duck slightly. "Where are we?" James asked, looking around the space. I walked to what looked like a small window covered with a piece of plywood and peered through a gap between the boards. Trees surrounded the shed on all sides, and I couldn't see any lights or buildings through the darkness. Somewhere in the woods behind the hospital property, I think. That tunnel must have taken us a couple 100 yards from the basement. The shed was filled with equipment that didn't match what I'd expect to find in an abandoned outbuilding. Several sleeping bags were rolled up against one wall, along with camping chairs and a portable table. Stacks of canned food sat on makeshift shelves, and gallon jugs of water occupied one corner. Someone had been using this place as a base camp or temporary shelter. But the equipment that caught my attention was more sophisticated than camping gear. A folding table held several electronic devices that looked like communication equipment: radios, battery packs, and what appeared to be small monitors or cameras. Cables ran from the equipment to a car battery that provided power. James had pulled out his camera and was photographing the space, his flash creating stark shadows on the wooden walls. "This is serious equipment," he said, focusing on the electronic setup. "Not the kind of stuff homeless people would have." I examined the surveillance gear more closely. The monitors were small but professional looking, and one showed a green-tinted image that looked like night vision footage. The view showed the exterior of a building that took me a moment to recognize as Riverside General Hospital from an angle I'd never seen before. "They're watching the hospital," I said, pointing at the monitor. "Someone's been using this place to keep surveillance on the building." James moved beside me to look at the screen. The image showed the hospital's parking area and the gap in the fence where we'd entered earlier. Anyone using this equipment would know when people were coming and going from the building. I was about to examine the other monitors when we both heard voices approaching from outside the shed. Male voices, multiple people, getting closer. James and I looked at each other, and I could see the same thought reflected in his expression. We were not supposed to be here. I grabbed James's arm and pointed toward the trap door we'd just climbed through. We both moved quickly but quietly, dropping back down into the chamber below the shed. I left the trap door open just a crack, maybe an inch, enough to see and hear what was happening above us, but hopefully not enough to be noticed. The voices got clearer as the men entered the shed. 4 of them, from what I could tell by the different tones and the way their footsteps moved around the small space. They all carried flashlights, the beams sweeping across the wooden walls and casting shifting shadows that I could see through the narrow opening. "Check the monitors," one voice said, older sounding, with authority in his tone. I heard someone moving around the surveillance equipment, the clicking of buttons or switches being flipped. The electronic hum I'd noticed earlier became more pronounced, like they were powering up additional systems. "Everything's clear," another voice reported. "No movement at the hospital since those 2 kids went in around 9. My stomach dropped. They'd been watching us. The whole time we'd been exploring the building, these people had known exactly where we were and what we were doing. James shifted beside me in the cramped chamber, and I could feel his tension radiating through the small space. We were both trying to breathe as quietly as possible while still getting enough air. The wooden rungs of the ladder pressed into my back as I crouched below the opening. "Maps are still here," a third voice said. "Route through Detroit looks good for tomorrow. Timing should work if we stick to the schedule." I could hear papers being shuffled around. Probably the maps one of them had mentioned. They were discussing locations I recognized, street names from downtown Detroit, intersections I'd driven through dozens of times. But they were talking about these places like waypoints on some kind of planned route. "What about the pickup on Cass?" the authoritative voice asked. "Confirmed for 6 a.m. We'll have about an hour window before traffic gets heavy." The conversation continued with more details about timing and locations, but I was having trouble processing the specifics. My mind kept racing ahead, trying to understand what kind of operation required this level of surveillance and planning. The professional equipment, the hidden tunnel, the careful coordination. This wasn't some small-time criminal activity. A different sound interrupted the discussion above us. A vehicle approaching from outside, engine noise getting closer before cutting off. Car doors slammed, and I heard new voices calling out to the men in the shed. "We're here," someone shouted from outside. "Got the package." Package. The word hit me wrong immediately, the way they said it with such casual indifference. I pressed my eye closer to the crack in the trap door, trying to see more of what was happening above us. 2 more men entered the shed, and between them they were dragging a young woman. My throat constricted as I saw her condition. She appeared barely conscious, her head lolling forward and her feet dragging behind her as they pulled her into the space. Her clothing was torn in several places, and her hands were bound behind her back with what looked like zip ties. "She giving you any trouble?" one of the original men asked. "Nah, she's been out most of the ride. Gave her something about 2 hours ago." The woman raised her head slightly, and in the flashlight beams I could see her face. She looked young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair that hung across her features. Her eyes were unfocused, struggling to stay open, like she was fighting against whatever drug they'd given her. "Buyers confirmed for Toledo?" the authoritative voice asked. "Yeah, they're expecting delivery tomorrow afternoon. Price is what we discussed." I felt James grab my wrist, his fingers pressing hard enough to hurt. The word buyers had the same effect on him that it had on me. We weren't listening to some random criminal discussion anymore. We were witnessing something that involved selling another human being. One of the men pulled out a cell phone and stepped away from the others, though I could still hear his side of the conversation clearly. "It's me," he said into the phone. "Package is ready for transport. We'll leave here around 5 in the morning. Should have her to you by noon." "Yeah, same condition as discussed. No problems with pickup." The woman tried to lift her head again, and this time she managed to make a sound. A weak cry, barely audible, but enough to catch the attention of the men around her. "Shit, she's coming around again," one of them said. I watched in horror as another man reached into a bag and pulled out a syringe that was already prepared. He flicked the needle to remove air bubbles, the same casual motion I'd seen nurses use for routine injections. But there was nothing routine about this. The woman saw the syringe approaching and tried to pull away, making a more desperate sound. Her movement was uncoordinated and weak, but she was clearly trying to escape whatever they were about to do to her. "Hold her still," the man with the syringe ordered. 2 of them grabbed her arms while the 3rd man injected something into her upper arm. Within seconds, her struggles stopped and her head dropped forward again, unconscious. "That should keep her quiet until we get there," the man said, tossing the empty syringe back into his bag. I had to close my eyes for a moment and focus on controlling my breathing. The casual way they handled her, like she was cargo instead of a person, made me feel physically sick. James's grip on my wrist had tightened even more, and I could hear his breathing becoming irregular beside me. They spent another 20 minutes in the shed, reviewing what sounded like detailed plans for the next day. Routes through different parts of the city, backup options if they encountered problems, contact numbers for various people involved in whatever network they were operating. I tried to memorize as many details as possible, though part of me kept hoping this was some kind of misunderstanding. But watching them load the unconscious woman into their vehicle eliminated any doubt about what we were witnessing. They carried her between them like a piece of furniture, no concern for her comfort or safety, discussing traffic patterns and delivery schedules while treating another human being as merchandise. The vehicles started up and drove away, leaving the shed quiet except for the electronic hum of the surveillance equipment. James and I stayed in the chamber for several more minutes, neither of us moving or speaking, both processing what we'd just seen. When I finally pushed the trap door open wider and climbed back up into the shed, my hands were shaking. The space looked exactly the same as before. The camping equipment, the maps, the electronic monitoring systems. But everything felt different now that I understood what it was really being used for. James climbed up behind me, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "David," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to call the police." I nodded, unable to trust my voice yet. We had stumbled into something that went far beyond urban exploration or trespassing. We had witnessed a human trafficking operation in progress. And somewhere out there, a young woman was being transported to people who had bought her like property. I waited until the sound of the engines completely faded before pushing the trapdoor open again. The shed sat empty now. Just the electronic equipment humming quietly and casting its green glow across the wooden walls. The absence of those men made the space feel even more sinister somehow, like walking through a crime scene that was still warm. "We need to go," I said, dropping back down into the chamber. "Right now." James was already positioned at the tunnel entrance, his camera bag clutched against his chest. Neither of us spoke as we started crawling back toward the hospital. The tunnel that had felt interesting and mysterious 30 minutes ago now seemed claustrophobic and endless. Every scrape of our knees against the concrete, every rustle of James's equipment bag sounded impossibly loud in the confined space. My shoulders burned from hunching forward and my knees were already tender from the earlier trip. But I pushed through the tunnel as fast as I could manage. The need to get out of this underground passage, to put distance between us and that shed, drove me forward through the cramped concrete tube. Behind me, James's breathing was labored and quick, matching my own elevated heart rate. The tunnel curved left, then angled downward toward the hospital basement. I had memorized the route during our earlier exploration, but now every section felt twice as long as before. The beam of my flashlight bounced ahead of me, illuminating the same smooth concrete walls and ceiling, but the familiar construction felt threatening rather than impressive. When we finally reached the chamber below the hospital storage room, I climbed the wooden ladder without testing the rungs this time. Getting out of the tunnel took priority over caution. James followed immediately behind me, and we both emerged into the storage room, breathing hard and covered in concrete dust. I led us out of the storage room and through the basement corridors at a pace that was just short of running. The morgue, the medical records area, the mechanical rooms. We passed all the spaces we'd explored earlier, but now they felt like obstacles between us and safety, rather than interesting architectural features. The stairwell to the main floor had never looked so welcoming. We climbed the concrete steps 2 at a time, burst through the heavy metal door, and headed straight for the main lobby without stopping to check any of the familiar rooms along the way. The broken ceiling tiles scattered across the lobby floor crunched under our feet as we crossed the space toward the exit. The wheelchair near the reception desk, the abandoned medical equipment in the corners, everything looked exactly the same as when we'd entered. But the building felt completely different now. What had been our comfortable second home for 2 years had become a place we needed to escape from as quickly as possible. We pushed through the main entrance and crossed the parking area toward the gap in the fence. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time since hearing those voices outside the shed, I felt like I could breathe properly. But even reaching the outside of the hospital grounds didn't slow our pace. James's car sat exactly where we'd left it, looking ordinary and reassuring under the distant streetlights. I pulled out my cell phone as soon as we reached the vehicle, my hands still shaking slightly as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I need to report human trafficking, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. We just witnessed people transporting a kidnapped woman." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, can you tell me your location?" I gave her our location at Riverside General Hospital and tried to explain what we'd seen as clearly as possible. The dispatcher's tone shifted from routine professionalism to something more cautious as I described the tunnel, the shed, the surveillance equipment, and the unconscious woman being loaded into a vehicle. "Sir, you said you were inside an abandoned hospital building." "Yes, but that's not the important part. These people had a kidnapped woman and they were talking about buyers and delivery schedules. They drugged her right in front of us." I could hear typing on her end as she took down the information. "Are you and your companion safe right now?" "Yes, we're in a car outside the hospital. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Please remain where you are and do not re-enter the building." I ended the call and looked at James, who was gripping his steering wheel and staring straight ahead at the hospital building. His camera bag sat on the floor between his feet, and I realized he'd carried that equipment through the entire tunnel crawl and escape without complaint. "How long do you think it'll take them to get here?" he asked. "I don't know. Hopefully not too long." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing what we'd witnessed and what we'd reported. The parking lot around us was completely quiet except for distant traffic noise from the main road. The hospital building loomed against the dark sky, looking abandoned and harmless from the outside, giving no hint of the operation that had been running beneath it. Headlights appeared at the entrance to the hospital grounds, followed by more vehicles. 3 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, their headlights sweeping across the broken pavement and creating sharp shadows around the scattered debris. A woman in plain clothes got out of the lead vehicle and walked toward us while uniformed officers emerged from the other cars. She looked to be in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back and the confident posture of someone used to taking charge of situations. "I'm Detective Chen," she said as I rolled down the window. "You're the caller who reported human trafficking?" "Yes, I'm David Wilson, and this is James Martinez." Detective Chen studied both of us for a moment, probably trying to assess whether we were reliable witnesses or just a couple of urban explorers who'd gotten spooked by something innocent. "I need you to walk me through exactly what you saw and where you saw it," she said. "But first, are either of you injured or in immediate danger?" "No, we're fine. But Detective, what we witnessed was real. They had a kidnapped woman, and they were planning to transport her to buyers. We heard them discussing the sale." She nodded, her expression becoming more serious. "I'm going to need you to show me this tunnel you mentioned and the location where you observed these activities. Can you take us back into the building?" James and I looked at each other. The last thing I wanted to do was go back into that hospital, especially down to the basement where we'd discovered the tunnel. But I knew Detective Chen needed to see the evidence for herself. "Yes," I said. "We can show you everything." Detective Chen spoke briefly with the uniformed officers, giving instructions I couldn't hear completely. One of them opened the trunk of his cruiser and pulled out additional flashlights and what looked like tactical equipment. "Follow me," Detective Chen said, walking toward the hospital entrance. We retraced our path through the gap in the fence, across the parking area, and through the main lobby. This time, several officers accompanied us with their own flashlights and equipment. The familiar route through the building felt surreal with a police escort, transforming our secret exploration into an official investigation. In the basement, I led Detective Chen to the storage room and pointed out the trapdoor exactly as we'd found it. She examined the wooden construction and the metal hinges, noting that they showed signs of recent use and maintenance. "You said you crawled through this tunnel to another building?" "Yes, it leads to a shed in the woods. That's where we saw the trafficking operation." Detective Chen spoke into her radio, calling for backup units and what sounded like a tactical team. She asked us to describe the route through the tunnel and the layout of the shed in as much detail as possible. "I need both of you to wait outside while we investigate this," she said. "Officers will escort you to a patrol car where you'll be safe, and I'll speak with you again after we've secured the scene." 2 uniformed officers led us back through the hospital and to one of the patrol cars in the parking lot. The back seat was hard plastic, designed for transporting suspects rather than comfort, but it felt secure after everything we'd been through. Through the car windows, we watched additional police vehicles arrive over the next hour. Some officers entered the hospital building while others disappeared into the wooded area behind the property, presumably to approach the shed from the surface rather than through the tunnel. James had been quiet since we'd started talking to Detective Chen, but now he turned to me with a look I couldn't quite read. "Do you think they'll find those people?" he asked. "I hope so. But even if they don't catch them tonight, at least the police know what's happening now." It was past midnight when Detective Chen returned to the patrol car. She looked tired but focused, like someone who'd found exactly what she'd expected to find and wasn't pleased about it. "We found the shed," she said, opening the car door. "Everything is exactly as you described. The surveillance equipment, the camping supplies, the maps. There's evidence of recent occupation, and we've secured the scene for processing." The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. For the past 2 hours, part of me had wondered if somehow I'd misunderstood what we'd witnessed, if maybe there was some innocent explanation for what we'd seen. Detective Chen's confirmation eliminated any doubt. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you both come with me to the station to give detailed statements about everything you saw and heard. This is going to be a complex investigation, and your testimony will be crucial evidence." I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman's face and heard the casual way those men discussed her delivery schedule. James picked me up at 8 in the morning, and neither of us said much during the drive to downtown Detroit. The police station sat on a busy street corner, a massive brick building that looked like it had been handling criminal investigations for decades. Detective Chen met us in the lobby and led us through a maze of hallways to a conference room on the 3rd floor. The space was smaller than I'd expected, with a rectangular table, uncomfortable chairs, and recording equipment set up along one wall. She had a thick folder of documents spread across the table and what looked like several hours' worth of preparation already completed. "I'm going to record everything you tell me," she said, testing the audio equipment. "Take your time with details, even if they seem minor. Sometimes the smallest observation becomes the most important piece of evidence." The statement process took longer than I'd anticipated. Detective Chen asked us to describe the entire evening chronologically, starting with our arrival at the hospital and ending with our phone call to 911. She stopped us frequently to clarify specific details, the exact wording of conversations we'd overheard, the physical descriptions of the men, the layout of the shed, the route through the tunnel. I found myself remembering things I hadn't consciously noticed at the time. The way one of the men had limped slightly when he walked, the smell of cigarette smoke on their clothing, the sound of gravel crunching under their vehicles when they'd arrived and departed. James added details I'd missed, like the specific camera equipment visible in the shed and the type of electronic devices on the folding table. "The surveillance setup was professional grade," Detective Chen said, making notes in her folder. "Not something you'd expect from a casual operation. This appears to be part of a larger network that's been using your hospital as a way station for moving victims through the region." She explained that the shed's monitoring equipment had probably been watching the hospital grounds for months, tracking when urban explorers or other visitors entered the building. The traffickers needed to know when the location was occupied so they could avoid using the tunnel during those times. "That's why you never encountered them before," she said. "They were watching your patterns and timing their activities around your visits." The realization made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't expected. All those times James and I had explored the hospital, thinking we were alone in the building, someone had been monitoring our movements from the woods. They'd known our schedules, our favorite rooms, how long we typically stayed during each visit. Forensic teams were still processing the shed and tunnel system, collecting DNA evidence, fingerprints, and any materials that might identify the traffickers or their victims. Detective Chen said the construction of the tunnel indicated significant planning and resources, suggesting this wasn't the work of amateur criminals. "We're coordinating with FBI agents who specialize in human trafficking cases," she said. "Operations like this often cross multiple state lines, which brings it under federal jurisdiction." About 2 hours into the statement process, Detective Chen opened a different section of her folder and pulled out several photographs. "Missing persons reports," she explained, "from cases throughout Michigan and Ohio over the past 18 months. I want you to look at these carefully," she said, arranging the photos on the table between us. "Tell me if you recognize anyone, particularly the woman you saw last night." The photographs showed young women, all appearing to be in their late teens or early 20s. Most were smiling in what looked like family photos or social media pictures, the kind of images people submitted to police when reporting someone missing. I studied each face, trying to match them against my memory of the woman in the shed. One photograph made me stop. A young woman with dark hair and features that looked familiar, even accounting for the difference between a posed photo and someone in distress. "This one," I said, pointing to the picture. "I think this might be her." Detective Chen picked up the photograph and checked the information on the back. "Sarah Thompson, age 22, reported missing from downtown Detroit 3 weeks ago. She was walking home from her job at a restaurant when she disappeared." The confirmation hit me harder than I'd expected. Seeing the woman's name and learning she'd been missing for 3 weeks made everything feel more real and immediate. She wasn't just a victim we'd witnessed. She was someone with a life and family who'd been searching for her. "Her parents have been calling every day for updates," Detective Chen said, putting the photograph back in the folder. "This is the first solid lead we've had in her case." James had been quiet during most of the statement process, but now he leaned forward and asked the question I'd been thinking about since we'd first climbed back up from the tunnel. "Do you think you'll be able to find her? I mean, they said something about Toledo and a noon delivery time." "We have units coordinating with police departments in Ohio," Detective Chen said. "The time frame you overheard gives us a window to work with, and we're checking known trafficking routes between here and Toledo." She warned us that we'd likely be called as witnesses if arrests were made, since our testimony provided direct evidence of the trafficking operation. Until the investigation concluded, she advised us to stay away from the hospital area entirely. "These people know that building was compromised," she said. "They might return to clean up evidence or look for whoever reported them. I don't want either of you anywhere near that location until we've made arrests." The warning made sense, but it also felt strange to be banned from a place that had been like a second home for 2 years. The hospital had gone from being our favorite exploration site to the center of a major criminal investigation, all because we'd been curious about a sound in the basement. Before we left the station, Detective Chen handed me a business card with her direct phone number written on the back. "Call me immediately if you remember anything else," she said. "Even details that seem unimportant. With cases like this, sometimes the smallest piece of information breaks everything open." I put the card in my wallet and followed James toward the exit. The lobby of the police station buzzed with activity. Officers coming and going, people reporting crimes, lawyers meeting with clients. Normal police business that had been happening while we'd spent 3 hours describing one of the worst things I'd ever witnessed. Outside on the sidewalk, James and I stood next to his car without getting in immediately. The morning had become overcast, and downtown Detroit looked busy with people heading to work and going about their regular routines. Everything appeared completely normal, which felt odd after spending the morning discussing human trafficking and missing persons cases. "I keep thinking about her parents," James said, unlocking the car doors. "Calling every day for 3 weeks, not knowing what happened to their daughter." I nodded, unable to find the right response. Part of me felt relieved that we'd done the right thing by reporting what we'd seen, but another part felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we'd stumbled into. Urban exploration had always been about discovering forgotten history and abandoned spaces, not uncovering active criminal operations. Detective Chen had made it clear that our accidental discovery might be the break investigators needed to dismantle a sophisticated trafficking network. But sitting in James's car outside the police station, all I could think about was Sarah Thompson's photograph and the hope that reporting what we'd witnessed might actually help bring her home. I was eating cereal in my kitchen when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Chen's number, and my stomach immediately tightened. 2 days had passed since James and I had spent 3 hours at the police station giving our statements, and I'd been checking my phone constantly, waiting for some kind of update about what they'd found. "David, this is Detective Chen. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Yes, definitely. Did you find anything?" "We found a lot more than we expected," she said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "First, the good news. We arrested 3 men yesterday evening connected to the trafficking operation. We tracked cell phone records from the area around the hospital and cross-referenced them with surveillance footage from nearby businesses." I set my spoon down and grabbed a pen from the kitchen counter, though I wasn't sure what I'd need to write. The relief of hearing about arrests was immediate, but Detective Chen's tone suggested there was much more to the story. "The men you saw in the shed were part of a larger network that's been using abandoned buildings throughout Michigan and Ohio to transport victims," she continued. "This wasn't just a local operation. They had locations set up across both states, always in places like your hospital where they could monitor access and avoid detection." She explained that the investigation had expanded significantly once federal agents became involved. The operation had been active for over 2 years, which meant dozens of victims had been moved through the network during that time. The professional construction of the tunnel system now made complete sense. These people had invested serious time and money into creating a transportation infrastructure. "We found Sarah Thompson," Detective Chen said, and I felt my breath catch. "She's alive, David. We located her in a warehouse outside Toledo, exactly where you overheard them planning to deliver her." The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down at my kitchen table. For 2 days, I'd been trying not to think about what might have happened to Sarah, whether our report had come too late to help her. Knowing she was alive felt like a weight being lifted off my chest. "Is she okay?" "She's in serious condition but receiving medical care. Trafficking victims often require extensive treatment, both physical and psychological, but she's conscious and able to communicate with investigators." Detective Chen went on to explain that the tunnel system extended much further than James and I had discovered during our exploration. The passage we'd crawled through connected to storm drains that eventually reached a network of safe houses used by the traffickers. Federal agents were mapping the entire system to understand how the operation had moved victims across state lines. "The FBI is taking the lead on this now," she said. "Operations that span multiple states fall under federal jurisdiction, and they have specialized units that handle trafficking cases." I asked about James and whether he'd been contacted yet. Detective Chen confirmed that both of us would need to testify at preliminary hearings for the arrested men, since our testimony provided direct evidence of the trafficking activities and the timeline of events. "Your observations in that shed are crucial evidence," she said. "Without your report, we never would have discovered this operation. The men were careful to avoid leaving traces that normal police work would have uncovered." The guilt I'd been carrying since that night in the hospital basement suddenly felt overwhelming. I told Detective Chen that I kept thinking about how long the operation had been running, how many victims might have been moved through that tunnel system while James and I were exploring the building above them, completely unaware. "David, listen to me," she said, her voice becoming more personal than professional. "You cannot blame yourself for not knowing about something that was deliberately hidden from detection. These people spent 2 years creating a system specifically designed to avoid discovery. The fact that you stumbled across it and reported it immediately makes you responsible for ending their operation." She mentioned that Evidence found in the shed had already led to the identification of other victims and additional arrests in Ohio and Pennsylvania. The maps we'd seen the traffickers discussing had provided investigators with locations of other safe houses and transportation routes. "How many other victims?" I asked. "7 so far, but the investigation is still expanding. Every piece of evidence we collect leads to more locations and more arrests." Detective Chen explained that the hospital was now under constant police surveillance while investigators searched for additional tunnel entrances and evidence of other criminal activities. The building that had been our comfortable second home was being treated as a crime scene, with forensic teams examining every room we'd explored during our 2 years of visits. "We're finding evidence that the basement storage room was used for more than just accessing the tunnel," she said. "There are signs that victims were held there temporarily, probably while traffickers waited for clear transportation windows. The thought of Sarah Thompson or other victims being kept in that basement while James and I explored the floors above made me feel sick. We'd walked past that storage room dozens of times, never knowing what was happening behind that door marked storage in faded black letters. "The preliminary hearings are scheduled for next week," Detective Chen said. "I'll email you the specific dates and times. The proceedings should be straightforward. You'll describe what you witnessed, and the defense attorneys might ask questions about your observations." She warned me that the defense would likely try to discredit our testimony by focusing on the fact that we'd been illegally entering the abandoned building. However, the evidence collected from the shed and tunnel system corroborated everything James and I had reported, making our observations crucial regardless of how we'd happened to witness them. "Will Sarah testify too?" I asked. "Yes, though probably via video link from the hospital. She's identified one of the defendants as her captor and provided details about where she was held that match the evidence we've collected." After Detective Chen ended the call, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone for several minutes. The cereal in my bowl had gotten soggy, but I couldn't bring myself to care about breakfast anymore. Learning that Sarah was alive felt like the most important news I'd received in years, but knowing about the other victims and the scope of the operation made everything feel heavier. I called James to let him know about the arrests and Sarah's rescue. He was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining what Detective Chen had told me. 7 other victims, he said finally. 7 people we might have helped if we'd found that tunnel months ago. I understood his guilt because I felt the same way, but I repeated what Detective Chen had said about the operation being deliberately hidden. We couldn't blame ourselves for not discovering something that law enforcement agencies with specialized training and resources had missed for 2 years. "I keep thinking about all those times we explored the basement," James said, "walking right past that storage room, never checking behind the debris. We weren't looking for hidden passages," I reminded him. "We were exploring architectural features and taking photos." After we ended the call, I spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on normal activities, washing dishes, checking email, planning what I needed to do that day. But my mind kept returning to the list of details Detective Chen had shared. 3 men arrested, Sarah alive but in serious condition, 7 other victims identified, a network spanning multiple states that had been active for over 2 years, the hospital building that had represented 2 years of peaceful exploration had become the center of one of the largest human trafficking investigations in Detroit's recent history. The basement we'd explored dozens of times had been housing victims while we'd walked through the floors above, completely unaware of the criminal operation happening below our feet. I realized that urban exploration would never feel the same way again. Every abandoned building would now carry the possibility of hiding something more sinister than architectural decay and forgotten history. The hobby that had been about discovering the past had accidentally led us into the middle of a very present and very real criminal operation. But Detective Chen's reassurance about our role in ending the trafficking network provided some comfort. Without our accidental discovery and immediate report to police, Sarah Thompson and the other victims might never have been found. The guilt about not acting sooner was starting to balance against the knowledge that our actions had actually made a difference. The preliminary hearings would require reliving that night in detail, describing what we'd witnessed to attorneys and judges who would use our testimony to build cases against the traffickers. James and I had gone from urban explorers to key witnesses in a federal investigation, all because we'd been curious about a scraping sound in the basement of our favorite abandoned building. I straightened my tie for the third time as I walked up the courthouse steps. 3 weeks had passed since Detective Chen's phone call about the arrests, and today James and I would testify at the preliminary hearing for the 3 men charged in the trafficking operation. The building looked intimidating in a way that police stations didn't, all marble columns and carved stonework that seemed designed to make people feel small. James met me in the lobby, wearing the only dress shirt I'd ever seen him in. He looked as nervous as I felt, clutching a folder of documents that Detective Chen had told us to bring. The courthouse bustled with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits, families of defendants, court reporters wheeling equipment between courtrooms. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged except us. Detective Chen found us near the metal detectors and guided us through security. She explained that we'd be called as the prosecution's primary witnesses, since our testimony established the timeline and provided direct evidence of the trafficking activities. The defense attorneys would try to challenge our credibility, but the physical evidence collected from the shed supported everything we'd reported. "Just tell exactly what you saw and heard," she said as we rode the elevator to the 4th floor. "Don't speculate about anything you didn't directly witness. The prosecutors will walk you through your testimony step by step." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood-paneled walls and rows of benches that reminded me of a church. The 3 defendants sat at a table near the front, wearing orange jumpsuits and ankle shackles. I recognized 2 of them immediately. The older man with the authoritative voice and one of the men who dragged Sarah into the shed. Seeing them in person again made my stomach tighten. But they looked diminished somehow, sitting between their lawyers in a brightly lit courtroom instead of standing over an unconscious woman in the woods. The prosecutor called my name first. Walking to the witness stand felt like crossing a much longer distance than the actual 20 feet between the gallery and the front of the courtroom. The bailiff administered the oath, and I placed my left hand on the Bible while raising my right. Swearing to tell the truth felt more significant than I'd anticipated. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with graying hair, began with basic questions about my background and experience with urban exploration. She asked how long James and I had been exploring together, how many times we'd visited Riverside General Hospital, and what had drawn us to the building that particular night. Then she moved into the specific events. I described our route through the hospital, the sound we'd heard in the basement, discovering the hidden trapdoor beneath the debris, walking step by step through the tunnel crawl and emerging into the shed, the camping equipment, surveillance monitors, and communication devices we'd found. "What happened when you heard voices approaching the shed?" she asked. I explained how we'd dropped back into the chamber below and left the trapdoor slightly open. How 4 men had entered and discussed their surveillance of the hospital, mentioning that 2 kids had entered around 9 o'clock, which was exactly when James and I had arrived. "Did they discuss any specific plans?" "Yes. They talked about maps and routes through Detroit. Someone mentioned a pickup on Cass at 6 a.m. with about an hour window before traffic got heavy. They were coordinating timing for something scheduled for the next day." The prosecutor asked me to describe what happened when the vehicle arrived. This part felt more difficult to talk about, even though I'd already described it to Detective Chen and rehearsed it in my mind dozens of times over the past 3 weeks. 2 more men entered the shed, dragging a young woman between them. She appeared unconscious or heavily drugged. Her hands were bound behind her back with zip ties. "Can you describe the woman's condition?" She was barely conscious. Her head was falling forward and her feet were dragging as they pulled her. Her clothing was torn. When she tried to lift her head, her eyes couldn't focus properly. I described hearing the men discuss buyers and delivery schedules, the phone call confirming transport arrangements for the next morning, and watching them inject the woman with something that made her completely unconscious. Throughout my testimony, I kept my eyes focused on the prosecutor rather than looking at the defendants, but I could feel their presence at the table across the courtroom. The defense attorney's cross-examination focused exactly where Detective Chen had predicted. He spent 20 minutes questioning why James and I had been illegally entering abandoned buildings, suggesting that our criminal trespassing made us unreliable witnesses. He asked whether we'd been drinking or using drugs that night, whether we might have misunderstood conversations we'd overheard from inside a hidden chamber. "Isn't it true that you and Mr. Martinez regularly engage in illegal activities? We explore abandoned buildings. We don't vandalize or steal anything. But you admit to repeatedly entering property without permission?" "Yes. And on this particular night, you were again committing criminal trespass when you claimed to have witnessed these events?" I looked at the prosecutor, who nodded slightly. "Yes, we were exploring the hospital without permission, but what we witnessed was human trafficking." The judge sustained several objections during the cross-examination, and after 30 minutes of questioning, the defense attorney sat down. The prosecutor asked me 2 follow-up questions to clarify timeline details, and then I was dismissed from the witness stand. James testified immediately after me, corroborating everything I described. He provided additional technical details about the surveillance equipment we'd seen and the camera angles on the monitors. The defense attorney tried the same approach with James, focusing on our illegal entry rather than challenging the substance of his testimony. The most powerful moment came when Sarah Thompson testified via video link from her hospital room. A large monitor was positioned where everyone in the courtroom could see her, and her voice came through speakers mounted on the walls. She looked much healthier than she had that night in the shed, but still fragile in a way that made the courtroom feel completely silent while she spoke. Sarah identified the older defendant as the man who had supervised her captivity and transportation. She described being held in the basement storage room at the hospital for 2 days before being moved through the tunnel system. Her testimony matched the physical evidence investigators had collected and provided details about the operation that only a victim could have known. "He told me they were taking me to Toledo," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "He said I needed to cooperate, or things would get much worse." The defense attorneys asked her only a few questions, clearly reluctant to challenge a trafficking victim's testimony in front of the judge. When her video link ended, the courtroom remained quiet for several seconds before the prosecutor called her next witness. After all testimony concluded, the judge ruled that sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial on all charges against the 3 defendants. He specifically noted that the testimony from James and me was admissible despite our illegal entry to the hospital, since the evidence we'd observed constituted exigent circumstances that outweighed any trespassing violations. The defendants' criminal activities were far more serious than any property violations committed by the witnesses, he said. Their observations led directly to the rescue of trafficking victims and the dismantling of a criminal network. Detective Chen found James and me in the hallway outside the courtroom after the hearing ended. She looked satisfied in a way I hadn't seen during our previous meetings, like someone who'd just completed a major project successfully. "The judge's ruling means we can use everything you witnessed as evidence in the trial," she said. "Your testimony today was exactly what we needed to establish the timeline and criminal intent." She told us the investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially expected. Evidence found in the shed had led federal agents to trafficking operations in 7 other states. 12 additional arrests had been made, and several more victims had been rescued from locations identified through documents and electronic records seized during the raids. "The tunnel system at your hospital was just one node in a much larger network," she explained. "These people had been operating across the Midwest for over 3 years, using abandoned buildings in multiple cities to transport victims between buyers." The scope of what we'd accidentally uncovered still felt overwhelming. James and I had been looking for interesting architecture and forgotten history, but instead we'd discovered what Detective Chen described as one of the largest human trafficking operations ever broken up in the region. "How many total victims?" James asked. 15 that we've identified so far, but the investigation is still ongoing. Every location we search provides evidence that leads to more arrests and more rescues. As we walked toward the courthouse exit, Detective Chen mentioned that Sarah Thompson was expected to make a full recovery, both physically and psychologically. She'd already begun working with federal victim services and planned to testify at the main trial when it went to court later in the year. "She specifically asked me to thank both of you," Detective Chen said. "She knows that your report is what led to her rescue." Outside on the courthouse steps, James and I stood together without speaking immediately. Downtown traffic moved past in normal patterns, people heading to lunch meetings and afternoon appointments. The world looked exactly the same as it had 3 hours earlier, but something fundamental had shifted in how I understood our accidental role in the investigation. For 2 years, urban exploration had been about discovering forgotten places and imagining their history. Buildings told stories through architectural details, abandoned equipment, and traces of the people who'd once used them. We'd been tourists in Detroit's industrial past, finding beauty in decay and meaning in abandonment. But standing outside the courthouse, I realized that abandoned buildings could hide much more than architectural history. They could conceal active criminal operations, ongoing human suffering, and networks of people who used forgotten spaces for purposes that had nothing to do with history or exploration. The hobby that had brought James and me together would never feel quite the same. Every abandoned building would now carry the possibility of hiding something more sinister than broken windows and scattered debris. Every unexplored room or hidden passage would require consideration of what might be concealed rather than what might be discovered. Yet I knew I'd continue exploring. The experience had taught me that curiosity and observation could lead to consequences far beyond personal satisfaction or interesting photography. Sometimes stumbling across the unexpected meant uncovering something that mattered more than forgotten architecture or industrial history. James asked if I wanted to grab lunch before heading home. I agreed, and we walked down the street toward a restaurant we'd noticed on our way to the courthouse. The conversation would probably focus on the hearing, the defendant's expressions during testimony, and speculation about how long the main trial might take. But as we walked away from the courthouse, I felt certain that urban exploration would remain part of my life. The difference would be approaching each abandoned building with awareness that they might hide more than just architectural decay and forgotten history. Some experiences change you permanently, and accidentally helping dismantle a human trafficking network definitely qualified as one of those experiences. The 3 men in orange jumpsuits would face trial for their crimes. Sarah Thompson and the other victims would continue recovering with support from federal services. The tunnel system beneath Riverside General Hospital would be permanently sealed, and James and I would eventually return to exploring abandoned buildings, but with a new understanding of the responsibility that came with curiosity about forgotten places.